Hey everybody, Mr. Harper here again, and last time we talked, as part of this oral cavity presentation, I left you with this lovely picture of unhealthy teeth and unhealthy gingiva, the fancy word for gums. We said that healthy gingiva is light pink. This is not. You can see how dark it is, especially up in this area. Healthy gingiva is tight to the tooth. This is not. It's pulled back from the tooth. Of course, the teeth are decaying, obviously. Healthy gingiva is stippled, has little dots. Funny enough, this gingiva does. You can see the little dots. Healthy gingiva is not puffy and does not bleed easy. I don't know if this would or not, but I bet you it would. So that's where we ended our conversation on the last time around, was talking about healthy gingiva. I want to continue our conversation today on the parts of the oral cavity. Remember, the oral cavity is your mouth. The oral cavity has two main parts. The oral cavity proper, that's just back behind your teeth, and the oral vestibule, which is the space between your lips and your teeth. So let's dive right in for today. Let's talk about the palate. The palate is the roof of your mouth. It's also the floor of your nasal cavity, and a cleft palate is where those two bones don't join together. We'll talk about that more in a minute. So look at this picture here of the skull. This is a sagittal view. They've cut it right in half. In fact, it's a mid-sagittal view. Of course, here are your teeth. And this little area right here, this dark yellow area, that's your mouth. Well, with your mouth open, it would be part of your mouth. But this area right here, this is the bone. It's called the maxilla. And there's also a bone in there called the palatine bone toward the back. But this is the bone that forms the roof of your mouth and the floor of your nasal cavity, because here's your nose would be right here if the soft part was still there. And this is a cavity here opening, and this is where you breathe through from you breathe in your nose, and then it comes down your throat here in the back. But so this part is what's called the hard palate, because if you tap the roof of your mouth, you're tapping and you're feeling this bone right underneath of it, and it's hard. Okay. Now, behind that is the area where there isn't a bone, this area back here, and that's called your soft palate. If you touch that area, you'll notice it's much softer. And of course, you run your finger too far back there, you get a gag reflex, so it'll make you gag. But if we turn this skull and looked at it from the front, you'd find that this bone, there's two pieces to it, and they joins right in the middle, right at your nose, right in the very middle of your nose. And if those two bones don't join together correctly in embryological development, which means when you were an embryo and then developed into a fetus in the uteri, still in the mother's womb, if those two bones don't fuse together correctly, you can end up with what is called a cleft palate. I want to show you some cleft palates. Here's a very, very, very severe cleft palate. Here's a more typical look, although this one is quite severe too. The two bones, one from this side and one from this side of this little girl, did not join together correctly. She actually had surgery to fix it. Here she is some years later with that bone fixed. So we'll talk more about cleft palate in person, because it's so much easier to show you what that looks like in person. Here's another way of looking at it. Here's your tongue. Here would be the part of your mouth. Here's the hard bone, the hard palate. And then here's the soft palate here. And the soft palate hangs down, forms what's called a curtain-like partition called the palatine velum. And that ends in the uvula right here, that little hangy ball thing in the back of your throat. Up here is your nasal cavity. So you breathe in through your nose, and air can go straight down the back of your throat here. Or you can breathe in or eat through your mouth and into that same area. This area back here, this common area, is called the pharynx. So let's talk a little bit more about the hard palate. Here we are, we're looking at it, and this would be these two bones that we're talking about for a cleft palate would come straight down the middle. Of course, it's covered with soft tissue now, your gingiva, so you can't see that area. But there's a small little bump right here called the incisal papillae. These are your front incisors, so that's why it's called incisal. It's a small bump there right behind the central incisors. There are folds on the hard palate called rugae, and you can actually run your finger up there, your tongue, and feel those folds. Right down the middle, there's a suture. A suture is where two bones meet that do not move, and the two bones are the parts of the maxilla that join together in embryological development, and that median palatine suture runs just this way. You can't see it because the bones, of course, are covered over by that soft material. And if those two bones don't join together to form that suture, that's when you get that thing we just talked about called a cleft palate. So that's the hard palate. Behind the hard palate is the soft palate. It goes all the way back to that back of that throat area called the pharynx. Here's the areas of the soft palate all the way back in here. And the uvula is hanging down here in the middle. And this palatine velum that I referenced is this whole piece here. It's another name for this back part of this soft palate that forms this curtain-like partition in the back, because you could, if you don't gag, stick your finger right back in here and behind this piece. You could actually physically go behind it, but you probably would gag if you tried to do that. Now, here's another way of looking at it. Here's the back here is the pharynx, the uvula, the hard palate up here, the soft palate, this area, and this whole part here is called the palatine velum. There are two arches, and you notice like this, you can see there's arch and then another arch over here. These are called the glossopalatine arches. There's two of them, well, one on each side, but it's one big arch. And then back behind it, there's a second arch. You see it back here? That arch is called the pharyngopalatine arch. Two arches, they're both part of the soft palate of this palatine velum area. But they're two arches to identify in the oral cavity. And sometimes you'll see them called fascias too. Now let's talk about another thing that's in the oral cavity, tonsils. Tonsils are part of your lymphatic system. They help with immunity, and you don't have to have them, but they're good to have because they help with the immune system. Some people have them taken out because they swell a lot and cause a lot of pain. So there are three sets of tonsils in your mouth. The first are called the lingual tonsils. Now, if you remember, lingual means tongue, so these tonsils are associated with the tongue. They cover a bone called the hyoid bone, which is the bone that your tongue attaches to down at the base. So here's your tongue. It's much thicker than you think. And down here in the bottom part of your throat, toward the back, is this bone right here called the hyoid bone that the tongue is attaching to. These tonsils are lymphatic tissue that cover around this bone. You can't see them when you open your mouth, because you would have to open your mouth really big and you're going back into your pharynx and then down your throat and looking right in here. Now, these tonsils could swell and be painful, and you might have to have them taken out because swelling could cause obstruction of this airway. If they swell really big, it could close this area off. You wouldn't want that. Oops, pardon me. Let me go back. But those are the lingual tonsils. Second set of tonsils are called the pharyngeal tonsils. They are located on the posterior wall of the pharynx behind the uvula. Remember, posterior means back. So if this is the pharynx, here's the wall right here. Here's the uvula. Your pharyngeal tonsils are up here in this area. They're not actually marked on this particular slide, but it's a good slide to see where they're at. They're up in here. If you open your mouth and you look in, you can't see them because they're up behind the uvula. Just like you can't see the lingual tonsils, they're down here on the hyoid bone. You also can't see the pharyngeal tonsils because they're up here. Second set of tonsils. There's a third set, and they're called the palatine tonsils. Remember those two arches I told you about? They're between the two arches. So here's one arch here. This is the back arch, the pharyngeal palatine arch, and then here's the front one, the glossopalatine arch. Here are the lingual tonsils. There's one here, there's one here. These are the ones you open your mouth and see. These are very swollen, and the person's probably going to need to have them taken out. They'd be very sore and starting to block the back of the throat area here. So those are the palatine tonsils, the ones you actually see. So we're going to stop right there. We've talked about some of the parts of the oral cavity. We talked about the tonsils. We'll talk more next time.